An Island Memory, English Bob. A short story by Louis Becke. There was once a South Sea Island supercargo named Denison who had a Kanaka father and mother. This was when Denison was a young man. His father's name was Kusis, his mother's Tulpe. Also, he had several brown-skinned, lithe-limbed, and big-eyed brothers and sisters who made much of their new white brother and petted and caressed and wept over him as if he were an ailing child of 6 instead of a tough young fellow of 22 who had nothing wrong with him but a stove-in rib and a heart that ached for home, which made him cross and fretful. But Denison hasn't got much to do with this story, so all I need say of him is that he had been the supercargo of a brig called the Leonora, and the Leonora had been wrecked on Strong's Island in the North Pacific, and Denison had quarrelled with the captain, whose name was Bully Hayes. And so one day he said goodbye to the roistering bully and the rest of his shipmates and travelled across the lagoon till he came to a sweet little village named Liasse and asked for Kusis, who was the head man thereof. "Give me, O Kusis, to eat and drink and a mat whereon to sleep, for I have broken apart from the rest of the white men who were cast away with me in the ship, and there is no more friendship between us, and I desire to live here in peace." Then Kusis, who was but a stalwart savage, nude to his loins and tattooed from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot, lifted Denison up in his brawny arms and carried him into his house and set him down on a fine mat. And Tulpe, his wife, and Kinia, his daughter, put food before him on platters of twisted cane and bade him eat. Then, when the white man slept, Kusis called around him the people of Liasse, and told them that that very day a messenger had come to him from the king, and said that the white man who was coming to Liasse was to be as a son to him. "For," said the king, "my stomach is filled with friendship for this man, because when he was rich and a supercargo he had a generous hand to us of Strong's Island. But now he is poor, and hath been sick for many months. So thou, Kusis, must be father to him, and give him all that he may want." So that is how Denison came to stay at Liasse and lived on the fat of the land in the quiet little village nestling under the shadows of Montboiche, while up at Utwe harbour on the south side of the island, Bully Hayes and his crew of swarthy ruffians drank and robbed and fought and cut each other's throats and stole women from the villages round about and turned an island paradise into a hell of base and wicked passions. But though Liasse was but 10 miles from Utwe, none of the shipwrecked sailors ever came there, partly because Captain Hayes had promised Denison that his men should not interfere with Liasse, and partly because the men themselves all liked Denison, and did not like the Winchester rifle he owned. And as he grew stronger and joined the villagers in their huntings and fishings, they made more and more of him, but yet watched his movements with a jealous eye, lest he should grow tired of them and go back to the other white men. Liasse, as I have said, was but a little village, not quite 30 houses, and stood on gently undulating ground at the foot of a mountain, whose sides were clothed with verdure, and whose summit at dawn and eve was always veiled in misty clouds. And so dense was the foliage of the mountain forest of Tamanu and Massaoi that only here and there could the bright sunlight pierce through the leafy canopy and streak with lines of gold the thick brown carpet of leaves covering the warm red soil beneath. Sometimes, when the trade wind had died away and the swish and rustle of the treetops overhead had ceased, one might hear the faint murmur of voices in the village far below, or the sharp, screaming note of the mountain cock calling to his mate, and now and then the muffled roar of the surf beating upon its coral barrier miles and miles away. But down from the gloomy silence of the mountain there led a narrow path that followed the winding course of a little stream, which in places leapt from shelves of hard black rock into deep pools perhaps 50 feet below, and then swirled and danced over its pebbly bed till it sprang out joyously from its darkened course above, into the bright light and life of the shining beach and the tumbling surf and sunlit, cloudless sky of blue that ever lay before and above the dwellers in Liasse village. Right in front of the village ran a sweeping curve of yellow beach, with here and there a clump of rocks, whose black, jagged outlines were covered with mantles of creepers and vines, green and yellow, in which at night time the snow-white tropic birds came to roost with clamorous note. Back from the beach stood groves of pandanus and breadfruit and coconuts, whose branches sang merrily all day long to the sweep of the whistling trade wind, but drooped languidly at sunset when it died away. Straight before the door of Denison's house of thatch, there lay a wide expanse of placid, reef-bound sea, pale greenish in its shallower portions near the shore, but deepening into blue as it increased in depth toward the line of foaming surf that ever roared and thundered upon the jagged coral wall, which flung the sweeping billows back in clouds of misty spume. Half a mile away and shining like emeralds in the bright rays of the tropic sun lay two tiny islets of palms that seemed to float and quiver on the glassy surface in the glory of their surpassing green. At dusk, when the shadows of the great mountain fell upon the yellow curve of beach, and the coming night enwrapped the silent aisles of the forest, the men of Leasse would sit outside their houses and smoke and talk, whilst the women and girls would sing the songs of the old bygone days when they were a strong people with spear and club in hand, and the mountainsides and now deserted bays of Strong's Island were thick with the houses of their forefathers. One evening, as Kusis, with Tulpe his wife and Kinia his daughter, sat with Denison on a wide mat outspread before the doorway of their house, listening to the beat of the distant surf upon the reef, and watching the return of a fleet of fishing canoes, they were joined by a half-caste boy and girl who lived in a village some few miles further along the coast. The boy was about 12 years of age, the girl 2 or 3 years older. Denison had one day met them, and they had taken him with them to their mother's house. She was a woman of not much past 30, and the moment the white man entered had greeted him warmly, and pointing to some muskets, cutlasses, and many other articles of European manufacture that hung from the beams overhead, said, "See, those were my husband's guns and swords." "Aye, and was he a white man?" "Aye," the woman answered proudly, as she brought Denison a mat to sit upon. "A white man, and, like thee, an Englishman, but it is 2 years now since he died under the spears of the men of Yap, when he led other white men to the attack on the great fort in the bay there. Ah, he was a brave man. And then I, who saw him die, came back here with my children to Liasse to live. For here in this very house was I born, and this land that encompasseth it is mine by inheritance." From that day, Denison and the two half-caste children became sworn friends, and twice or thrice a week the boy and girl would walk over to see him and stay the night so as to accompany him fishing or shooting on the following day. The boy was a sturdy, well-built youngster, with a skin that, from constant exposure to the sun, was almost as dark as that of a full-blooded native. But the girl was very light in complexion, with those strangely deep, lustrous eyes common to women of the Micronesian and Polynesian people, eyes in whose liquid depths one may read the coming fate of all their race, doomed to utter extinction before the inroads of civilization with all its deadly terrors of insidious and unknown disease. Unlike her brother, who either could not or pretended he could not understand English, Tassia both understood and spoke it with some fluency, for with her mother and brother she had always accompanied her father in his wanderings about the Pacific, and had mixed much with white men of a certain class, traders, pearl-shellers, and deserters from whale ships and men of war. For some minutes Kusis and his white friend smoked their pipes in silence, whilst Tulpe and the two girls sat a little apart from them, talking in the soft, almost whispered tones peculiar to the Malayan-blooded women of the Caroline Islands, and looking at some boys who were boxing with the half-caste lad nearby. "Ha!" said Tassia to the two men with a laugh. "See those foolish boys trying to fight like English people." "What know you of how English people fight, Tassia?" asked Denison. The girl arched her pretty black brows. "Much. I have seen my father fight, and he was the greatest fighter in the world." "Truly? Truly? Is it not so, Kusis?" "Aye," said Kusis, turning to Denison. "He was a great fighter with his hands as well as with musket and sword. Tell him, Tassia, of how thy father fought at Ebon." "When I was but 10 years old, there came to Layla harbour on this island a great English fighting ship, and my father, who had run away from just such another ship long years before in a country called California, became troubled in his mind, and hid himself in the forest till she had gone. When he returned to his house, he said, pointing to many letters and tattoo marks on his breast and arms, 'Only because of these names written on my skin have I lived like a wild boar in the woods for 3 days. For see, this name across my breast, were it seen by the people of the man of war, would bring me to chains in a prison, and I should see thee no more. And so, because he feared that another man of war might come here, he had the whole of his breast, back, and arms tattooed very deeply, after the fashion of Strong's Island, so that the old marks were quite hidden. Yet even then he was still moody, and at last he took us away with him in a whale ship to an island called Ebon, 10 days' sail from here. And here for a year we lived, although the people were strange to us, and their language and customs very different to ours. As time went on, the Ebon people began to think much of my father because of his great bodily strength and courage in battle, for they were at war among themselves, and he was ever foremost in fighting for Labayan, the chief under whose protection we lived. One day a great American warship came into the lagoon of Ebon, and many of the sailors came ashore and got drunk, and as they staggered about the village, frightening the women and children, one of them, hearing that my father was a white man, came to him as he sat quietly in his house, gave him foul words, and then said, "Come out and fight, thou tattooed beast, who calleth thyself a white man." There were many sailors gathered outside the house, and these, because my father took no heed of the drunken man's words, but bade him go away, called out that he was but a beachcombing coward and had no white blood in him, else would he take up the challenge. Then Bob, for that was my father's name, put a loaded musket in my mother's hand and said, "I must fight this man, but stand thou at the door, and if any one of the others seeks to enter the house, fear not to shoot him dead." Then he stepped out to the sailors and said, dash, dash, "Why must I fight this man? What quarrel hath he with me, or I with him? And I shall not fight with a man when he is tam-trunk, and cannot stand straight on his feet." "Fight him," they answered, "else shall we pull thy house down and beat thee for an English cur." And then I heard the sound of blows and could see that Bob and the man who challenged him were fighting. Presently I heard the sound of a man falling, and the blue-coated sailors gave a great cry, and I saw my father standing alone in the ring. At a little distance lay the American, whose body was supported by two of his friends. His head had sunk forward on his chest, and those about him said to my father, "His jaw is broken." My father laughed. "Whose fault is that? Ye forced me to fight, and I struck him but once. Is there no one man among ye who can do better than he? 'Tis a poor victory for an Englishman to break the jaw of a man who thought he could fight, but could not." Then he mocked them and said they were skeeters, boasters, like all the Yankees. For now he was angry, and his eyes were like glowing coals. But they were not all skeeters, for 2 or 3 stepped out and wanted to fight him. But the others stayed them, and said to my father, "Nay, no more now. Go back to thy wife. But tomorrow night we shall bring a man from the other watch on board the ship whom we will match against thee." Then they lifted up the man with the broken jaw and carried him away. In the morning there came to our house 2 sailors bearing a letter which my father read. It said that there would come ashore that night the best fighting man of the ship, who would fight him for $100 in silver money. Now 13 silver dollars was all the money my father had, so he went to Labayan the chief, who had a strong friendship for him, and read him the letter. "Lend me," said he, $37, and I will fight this man. And if I be beaten, and the $50 are lost, then shall I give thee a musket and 5 fat hogs for the money lent me. Now Labayan could not refuse my father, so without a word he brought him the money and placed it in his hands, and said, "Take it, O Papu the strong, and if it be that thou art beaten in the fight, then I forgive thee the debt. It is God's will if this man prove the stronger of the 2. At sunset 2 boats filled with men came ashore. 86 were they altogether, for my mother and I counted them as they walked up from the beach to the great open square in front of the chief's house. All round the sides of the square were placed mats for them to sit upon, and presently baked fish and fowls to eat and young coconuts to drink were put before them by the people, who were gathered together in great numbers, for the news of the fight had gone to every village on the island, and they all came to see. As darkness came on, hundreds of torches were lit and held up by the women and boys. By and by, when the sailors had finished eating, Labayan and his 2 wives came out and sat down at one end of the square, and my mother and I sat with them. And then, as fresh torches were lit, so that the great square became as light as day. A man rose up from among the white men and stepped into the center. "Where is the man?" he said. "Here," answered my father, pushing his way through the swarm of people who stood tightly packed together behind the sitting white men. "And here is my money," and he held out a small bag. "And here is ours," said some of the sailors, coming forward, and the money was placed in Labayan's hands. Then one of them opened a bottle of grog, and my father and the other man each drank some. Then they stripped to their waists. My father was thought to be a very big and strong man. But when Labayan and his people saw the other man take off his jumper and shirt, and beheld his great hairy chest and muscles that stood out like the roots of a tree when they protrude from the ground, they murmured, "He will kill Papu," they said. So Labayan cried, "Stop," and standing up and speaking very quickly said, "O Papu, there must be no fight. But tell all these white men that the man they have brought to fight thee shall have the money that is in my hands. And tell them also, so that they shall not be vexed, that the women and girls shall dance for them here in the square till sunrise." My father laughed and shook his head, but told the white men Labayan's words, and they too laughed. "Nay, Labayan," said my father, "fight I must, or else be shamed. But have no fear, this will be a long fight, but I am the better of the two. I know this man. He is an Englishman like myself, and a great fighter. But he does not know me now, for it is many years since he saw me last." And then he and the sailor shook each other by the hand, and then began the fight. It was terrible to look at, and soon I began to tremble, and I hid my face on my mother's bosom. Once I heard a loud cry from the assembled people, and looking up saw my father stagger backwards and fall, but only for a moment. And as he rose again, the white men clapped their hands and shouted loudly. And again I hid my face as the two met again, and the sounds of their blows and their fierce breathing seemed like thunder in my ears. Presently they rested a while, and now the torches blazed up again. And as the women saw that the face of the big man was reddened with blood which ran down his body, their hearts were filled with pity. A great wailing cry broke from them, and they ran up to Labayan and besought him to bid the fight to cease. But the white men said it must go on. As the two men rested, sitting on the knees of two of the sailors, they each drank a little grog, just a mouthful. Then they stood up again, staggering about like drunken men, and my mother and I, with many other women, ran into Labayan's house and wept together, for we could no longer look. Suddenly we heard a great cry of triumph from the assembled people, but the white men were silent. Then Labayan called to us to come and see, so we ran out into the square again. The big white man lay upon a mat, but he was horrible to look at, and we turned our faces away. My father sat near him, held up by Labayan and one of the white sailors, and lying beside his open hand were the 2 bags of money, but his eyes were closed, and he breathed heavily. As the people, white and brown, thronged around the big man to see if he were dead, we heard the tramp of marching men, and a score of sailors carrying muskets with swords fastened to their muzzles came across the square. They were led by 2 officers who held drawn swords in their hands. "What is this?" said he who was leader sternly, looking first at one and then at another of the white sailors. Then they told him, and said it had been a fair fight. "Back to the boats, every man," he said. "But first carry this dying man into a house, where he must lie till the doctor comes to him." And then, when this was done, the armed men drove the others down to the boats, and the square became dark and deserted. My father was but little hurt, and all that night he sat beside the man he had fought, who lay sick for many days in Labayan's house. Every morning the doctor from the ship came to see him, and other white men came as well. At last he got better, and then he and my father had a long talk together, and shook each other's hands and became as brothers. Then the boat came for him, and the beaten man bid us all farewell and went away. That night my father told us that this man, who was named Harry, had once been a friend of his, and they had served the Queen of England together in the same man-of-war, and, like him, had run away from the ship. And as soon as my father met him face to face in the square, he knew him. "And," said he, "it came hard to me to fight a man who was once my friend and was still my countryman. But yet it had to be done to shame those boasting Yankees who are but skeeters." And now, as I think of Tasia's story, there springs upon my memory the tale of the fight told of in The Man from Snowy River, where an Australian station manager, fresh from England, fought a terrible fight with an intruding drover. So, only changing 4 words of Saltbush Bill, and with all apologies. Now the sailor fought for a money prize with a scowl on his bearded face, but the trader fought for his honour's sake and the pride of the English race. In the old beachcombing days, a white, misty rain squall swept down the mountain pass at the head of Layla Harbour, plashed noisily across the deep waters of the landlocked bay, and whirled away seaward. Standing upon jutting ledges of the inner or harbour reef, a number of brown-skinned women and children were fishing. The tide was low and the water smooth, and as the fishers shook the raindrops from off their black tresses and shining skins of bronze, they laughed and sang and called out to one another across the deep reef pools. "Aye!" cried a tall, slender girl, naked to her hips, around which she wore, like her older and younger companions, a broad, woven sash of gaily coloured banana fibre. "Aye! 'Tis a cold rain, but now will the fish bite fast, and I shall take me home a heavier basket than any of ye here." And then she deftly swung her long bamboo rod over the pool on whose rugged brink she stood. "Ta, listen to her!" called out a round-faced, merry-eyed little woman who fished on the other aid. "Listen to Nia the Wisehead. She hath not yet caught a fish, and now boasteth of the great basketful she will take home. Get thee home for thy father's say net, for thou canst not catch anything with thy rod." And the speaker, with a good-humoured laugh, took a small fish out of the basket that hung at her side and threw it at the girl. Nia, too, laughed merrily as she ducked her head and twisted her lithe young body sideways, and the fish, flying past her face, struck a boy who stood near to her in the back. He swung round and with mock ferocity hurled the fish back at she who threw it. "That for thee, fat-faced tulpe, and would that it had gone into thy big mouth and down thy throat and choked thee. Then would thy husband call me friend and seek out another wife. For look thou, tulpe, thou art getting old and ugly now." A loud shriek of laughter from Nia, a merry mocking echo from those about her, joined in with Tulpe's own good-natured chuckle, and then, flinging down their rods and baskets, they sprang into the water one after another and played and laughed and gambled like the children they were all in heart, if not in years. By and by the sun came out, hot and fierce, and the women and children, rods in hand and baskets on backs, made homewards to their village across the broken surface of the reef. Right before them it lay, a cluster of some 2 or 3 score of grey-thatched, saddle-backed houses, with slender, sharp-pointed gables at either end. Nearest to the beach and distinguishable from the others by its great size was the dwelling of Togusa, the chief of Layla Harbour. At a distance of 50 feet or so from its canework sides, a low wall of coral slabs surrounded it on 4 sides, with gateways at back and front. Within, the walled-in space was covered with snow-white pebbles of broken coral, save where a narrow pathway led from the front gateway to the open doorway of the house. On came the fishers, the older of the women walking first in 2s and 3s, the young girls and boys following in a noisy, laughing crowd. But as they drew nearer to the low stone wall, their babbling laughter died away, and they spoke to each other in lowered tones. For it had ever been the custom of Kusaya, Strong's Island, the eastern outlier of the Caroline archipelago, to speak in a whisper in the presence of a chief, and Togusa, chief of Lela, was master of the lives of 4,000 of the people. Other chiefs were there on Kusai, who lived at Utwe and Maut and Lease, and whose people exceeded in numbers those of the chief of Lela. But none were there whose name was so old and whose fame in battle would compare with his. So, with softened steps and bodies bent, the women entered through the narrow gateway one by one and knelt down in front of the door in the manner peculiar to the women of the Caroline Islands, bringing their thighs together and turning their feet outward and backward. Apart from them and clustering together were the boys, each sitting cross-legged with outspread hands upon the pebbled ground. And then all, women, girls, and boys, bent their eyes to the ground and waited. Presently there came to the open doorway of the chief's house an old, white-haired woman who supported her feeble steps with a stick of ebony wood. For a moment or two she looked at the people assembled before her, And then a girl who followed her placed upon the canework veranda of the house a broad white mat and spread it out for her to sit upon. Slowly, the old woman stooped her time-worn frame and sat. And then the slave girl crouched behind her and with full, luminous eyes looked over her mistress's shoulder. Suddenly the dame raised her stick and tapped it twice on the cane work floor, and then, with a quick, soundless motion, the fishers rose, and with bent heads and stooping bodies crept up near to her and laid their baskets of fish silently at her feet. But though they spoke not themselves, each one, as she or he placed a basket down, looked at Sipi, the slave, and made a slight movement of the lips. And Sipi, in a low voice and looking straight before her, murmured the giver's name to the old woman. "'Tis the gift of Kinio, the wife of Nara, to Sea, the mother of Togusa the king. 'Tis the gift of Leisure, the daughter of Naril, to Sea, the mother of the king." And so, one by one, they laid down their tribute till the offering was finished, and they had crept back again to the place where they had first awaited old Sia's coming. And now they sat and waited for the king's mother to speak. "Come hither, Nia." At the sound of the old woman's voice, the girl Nia came quickly out from amongst her companions and sat down beside the piled-up baskets of fish. "Count thee out 10 fish for Togusa the king, 10 each for his wives, and 2 for Sipi, the slave." With deft hands, the girl did the old dame's bidding and placed the fish side by side upon narrow leaf platters brought to her by the young slave girl. "Good," said old Siaya, smiling at the girl, for Nia was niece to Sikra, and Sikra was one of the king's most trusted warriors and nephew to old Siaya. "Good child, and now tell the people that Togusa the king is sick, and so comes not out today to see their offerings of goodwill to him and his house. So let them away to their homes, taking with them all the fish they have brought save these 52 here before me." Again the women crept up, and each taking up her basket again walked slowly away through the gateway and disappeared among the various houses. But Nia, at a sign from the king's mother, remained, and sat down beside Sipi, the slave. By and by, with much stamping of feet and singing a loud chorus, came a party of men, tall, stalwart fellows, stripped to their waists, with their long black hair tied up in a knob at the back of their heads. As they reached the gate, their songs ceased, and each man placed the basket of taro or yams he carried at the feet of the old dame. From each basket, the girl Nia, at old Siaya's command, took 1 taro and a small yam for the king's household. Then the men, picking up the baskets again, followed the women into the village. So for another hour came parties of men and women and children, brown, healthy, strong and vigorous, carrying their daily offerings to the king of fish and fowl and wild pigeons and baked pigs and young coconuts and bananas and other fruits of the rich and fertile Kusai. Then when the last of them had come and gone, the slave girl Sipi put a small conch shell to her lips and blew a note, and men and women, slaves like herself, appeared from the rear of the house and carried the baskets away to the king's cookhouses. This was the daily life of Layla. At the very break of dawn, when the trees and grass were heavy with the dews of the night, and the flocks of mountain parrots screamed shrilly at the rising sun, and the wild boar scurried away to his forest lair, the people were up and at work among their plantations or out upon the blue expanse of Layla Harbor in their canoes. For though there was no need for them to do but the merest semblance of toil, yet it was and always had been the custom of the land for each family to bring a daily gift of food to the king. Sometimes, if a whale ship lay outside the harbor, the king would take all they brought, to sell to the ship in exchange for guns and powder and bright turkey-red cloth. But beyond this he took but little of all that they gave him day after day. They were a happy, contented race, and their land was a land of wondrous fertility and smiling plenty. Sometimes, even in those far-off days, a whale ship cruising northwestwards to the Moluccas or the coast of Japan would sail close in, back her main yard and send her boats ashore and wait till they returned laden to the gunwales with turtle, yams, and fruit. Dearly would the crew, as they gazed upon the bright beaches and the thickly clustered groves of palms amid which nestled the grey roofs of thatch, have liked the ship to have sailed in and heard the cable rattle through the hawse-pipes as her anchor plunged through the glassy depths of Layla Harbor. But Layla was seldom entered by a ship of any size. Her boats might come in if the captain so choose, and the rough, reckless seamen might wander to and fro among the handsome, brown-skinned people, and make sailors' love to the laughing Kusayi maidens, till the ship fired a gun for them to return. But the ship herself dared not enter. Not that there was danger of treachery from the people, but because of the narrow, tortuous passage and the fierce, swift current that ever eddied and swirled through its reef-bound sides. Once, indeed, in those olden days, the captain of an English whale ship that lay to outside had seen a small schooner lying snugly moored abreast of the king's house, and had boldly sailed his own ship in and anchored beside the little trading vessel. In a week, a dozen of his crew had deserted, lured away from the toils of a sailor's life by the smiles of the Kusai girls. Then he tried to get away before he lost any more men. 3 times he tried to tow his ship out with her 5 boats, and thrice, to the secret joy of the Kusai people and his crew, had he to return and anchor again. At the 4th attempt, the ship struck and went to pieces on the reef. In those wild days, and for long years afterwards, there were some 5 or 6 white men living on Kusai. They were of that class of wanderers who are to be met with even now among the little-known Caroline and Pellew groups and on some of the isolated islands of the North Pacific. Of those that lived on Kusai, however, our story has to do with but one, an old and almost decrepit sailor named Charles Westall, who then lived at Layla under the protection of Togusa, as he had lived under the protection of that chief's father 30 years before. With those white men who lived in the 3 other districts of the island, he had had no communication for nearly 10 years, although he was separated from them but half a day's journey by boat or canoe. Not that he did not desire to see them, but simply because the intense jealousy that prevailed between the various native chiefs who ruled over these districts made visiting a matter of danger and possible bloodshed. Each chief was extremely jealous of his white protégé, who, although he was exceedingly well treated and lived on the fat of the land, was yet kept under a friendly but rigid surveillance, lest he should be tempted to leave his own district and settle in another. Westall, therefore, as his years and infirmities increased, resigned himself to the knowledge that except when a ship might call at Layla, he would not be likely to ever converse again in his mother tongue with men of his own colour. He was, although an uneducated man, one of singular energy and discernment, and had, during his 40 years' residence on the island, acquired a considerable influence over the chief Togusa and the leading native families. He was by trade a ship's carpenter, and attracted by the intelligence of the natives and the professions of friendship made to him by Togusa's father, had deserted from his ship to live among them. Unlike many of his class, he was neither a drunkard nor a ruffian, and eventually marrying a daughter of one of the minor chiefs of Layla, he had settled down on the island for a lifelong residence. As the years went by and his family increased, so did his status and influence with the natives, and at the time of our story he lived in semi-European style in Layla village, about a stone's throw from the house of Togusa. He had now some 20 or 30 children by his 5 wives, for in accordance with native custom he had to increase the number of his wives as his wealth and influence grew, and these had mostly intermarried with natives of pure blood, so that in course of years the old English sailor's household resembled that of some scriptural patriarch who was honoured in the land. Early in the morning on the day following the scene described at the king's house, old Westall was sitting outside his boat shed smoking his pipe and watching some of his white-brown grandchildren at play, when a young native girl came quickly along the groves of breadfruit and coconut and called out that she had news for him. A ship, she said, was in sight. "Come thou inside, little one," said the old sailor kindly, speaking in the Kusai tongue. Indeed, he had but seldom occasion to speak English. The girl was Nia, the niece of Sikra, and was betrothed to Ted, one of old Westall's younger sons. She was about 15 or so, and was possessed of that graceful carriage and those faultlessly straight features common to women of the Micronesian islands. Seating herself on the ground beside the old man and, in accordance with native fashion, not deigning to notice her lover, who was that moment at work in his father's boat shed, the girl told Westall that she and some other girls had seen a small white-painted ship about 4 miles off, making towards Layla. The old sailor's face instantly became troubled, and he called to his son to come to him. "Ted," said the old man, speaking in English, "that mission ship has come at last, and now there's going to be a bit of trouble. You see if there won't." Edward Westall, a short, thick-set youth of 20, with a darker complexion than that of the girl who sat at his father's feet, leant upon the adze he carried and said in his curious broken English, "How you know she's missionary? Has you ever seen missionary ship?" "No," replied the old man shortly, "and I don't want to see one. But I know it's a missionary ship. She's painted white, and I heard from Captain Deaver of the half-caste Deaver that there was a mission ship at Honolulu 2 years ago, and she was painted white and was coming here right through this group. Blast her." "Well, and what you going to do? You think Tagusa going to let a missionary come ashore and live?" "That's just what I don't know, boy. Tagusa likes the white men, and maybe he may take to these Yankee psalm singers. And if he does, it just means that you and me and all the rest of us will have to clear out of here and seek for a living elsewheres. They is hungry beggars, these missionaries, and drives every other white man away from wherever they settles down. And I'm getting too old now to be badgered about by people like them. Why don't you go and tell Tagusa to keep 'em from coming ashore?" The old man shook his head. "No good, boy. I managed to block one missionary from landing here, that fella that came here in the Shawnee whaler when you was a babby, and I've always been telling Tagusa that it will be a bad day for him when he lets one of them come here, but—" and he shook his head again. "He's a weak man, and just like a child. His father was another sort, and had a head chock full of sense." For a moment the old seaman seemed sunk in thought, and then suddenly aroused himself. "Ted," he said, "just you go along with Nia to her Uncle Secra and tell him and Jirani and the other big chiefs to come here and have a talk with me. Togusa is sick, and so I can't get in to see him." Throwing down his adze, the young half-caste beckoned to the girl to rise and come with him. With that passive obedience common among women of her race when spoken to by a man, the girl instantly rose and followed her betrothed husband, who, from the broad blue stripes of tattooing that covered his naked arms and thighs, would never have been taken for anything else but a pure-blooded native. Then old Westall, still wearing a troubled look upon his brown and wrinkled face, walked slowly back to his thatched dwelling and sat down to wait for the native chiefs to talk with them over the danger that, from his point of view, menaced them all. 4 miles away, the mission brig, for such indeed was the strange ship, was sailing slowly along the precipitous northern coast of the island. On the poop deck were 4 clerical gentlemen clothed in heavy black, and each bore in his face an expression of great interest as the various points of the beautiful island opened to their view. Seated a little apart from the others, as befitted his position and dignity as their leader, was the Reverend Gilead Ball. He was a man of nearly 6 feet in height, with shaven upper lip and white beard, and his eyes, keen, cold, and grey, had for the past 10 minutes been bent over a copy of the Scriptures, outspread upon his huge knees. Of his 4 colleagues, all that need be said is that in manner of speech, dress, and appearance, generally they were minor editions of the Reverend Ball. They were but strangers in the islands, having only arrived at Honolulu from Boston 6 months previously, and had been selected by their principal, the Reverend Gilead, to accompany him on his present mission. Presently, Mr. Ball closed the book and, rising from his seat, walked up to the captain, who was anxiously scrutinizing the line of reef along which the mission brig was sailing. "Friend," said he, placing his hand with condescending familiarity on the captain's shoulder and speaking in soft, gentle tones, "it hath pleased God to bless us with a prosperous voyage to this, the first corner of the vineyard, and ere we sail into the haven before us and venture our lives among the raging heathen, it would be well for us to stay the ship a while the brethren and myself, together with the mariners of this chosen bark, render up our offerings of praise and thanksgiving for the manifold mercies vouchsafed to us upon the stormy ocean." A subdued murmur of approval came from one of the younger missionaries, who, clasping his hands together, gazed with a rapt expression at Mr. Ball. The captain of the brig looked and felt uncomfortable. "Just as you please, sir, but I would like to get the ship to an anchor as quickly as possible. I've never been here before, and this Strong's Islander we have brought with us seems kinda stupid. and I really believe the creature doesn't know enough for me to take the ship in by his directions. I guess he's a fool." The missionary's face assumed a loftily severe expression. "Captain Brandon, you surprise me. Nay, more, you pain me. This young man—" and he placed his large, coarse hand on the head of an undersized native, clothed like himself, in a long black coat and wearing a stovepipe hat with a wide, battered rim. "You do indeed pain me when you speak of this pious young man, one of God's ministers, as a fool." The native he indicated, who 12 months before had been one of the crew of an American whale ship, but was now the Reverend Purity Lacololai, turned a dull, stupid face upon the captain and, encouraged by the protecting glance of his white leader, muttered something under his breath. "Well, I meant no offense, Mr. Ball, but I feel somewhat anxious about getting to an anchor as soon as possible." "Captain Brandon," said the missionary pompously, "it is my wish and the wish of the brethren with me that we offer up supplication for the success of our cause. Will you kindly call the mariners to the stern of the ship so that they may join with us in devotional exercises befitting the occasion?" The master of the brig nodded, and muttering the words "darned rot" under his breath, gave the order for the crew to lay aft. It is necessary to explain that the presence of the Reverend Mr. Ball and his brethren was largely due to the fact that 12 months previously, the Reverend Purity Lacollalai, then a native sailor, had run away from his ship at Honolulu. He was a low-caste Strong's Islander and spoke whaleship English fluently. By some means he came under the notice of the Reverend Gilead, who, learning that he was a native of Kusai, immediately set about his conversion, with the result that Lacollalai, being in a certain sense a man of the world and deeply sensible of the material advantages to be derived from his new friends, expressed the deepest grief at his own and his countrymen's ignorance of the truths of the gospel. In the course of a week or two, reports were sent home to Boston that, by a marvelous dispensation of Providence, an intelligent young chief had been rescued from the degrading life of a whaler's forecastle, and had greatly moved the American brethren at Honolulu by his pictures of the hopeless savagery and sinful customs of his people. Furthermore, he had become concerned for his soul's welfare, and was now at that time eagerly imbibing the truth with tears of thankfulness. As a natural corollary to this intelligence, subscriptions were asked for to send out a band of brethren to plant the word on the heathen field of Kusai. In due course the subscriptions and brethren came, and then followed the imposing function of ordaining Lacollalai, formerly a slave and a burning brand, a minister of the American Board of Missions. Then came the departure of the mission brig from Honolulu with the missionary party just described. An hour afterward, the devotions concluded, the brig sailed into Lela Harbor and dropped anchor off the King's House. At 8 o'clock next morning, nearly 1,000 natives were assembled on the gravelled space in front of the King's House, all waiting to see the white strangers land. Already a rumor had gone forth that they were the bearers of a message from a great king to their own chief Togusa, but who the White King was and what the message was about, none knew. In a few minutes, a boat left the ship and rowed to the beach, and 4 white men, wearing stovepipe hats and carrying white umbrellas, stepped out and walked up to the king's gateway. At their heels followed Mr. Lacollalai, dressed in exactly the same manner, and carrying, in addition to his umbrella, a large, heavy volume. At the entrance to the king's grounds the party halted, and then some discussion took place between them and Brother Lacollalai, who seemed inclined to fall back. "'Tis but the weakness of the flesh," said Mr. Ball to his brethren. "Our brother is somewhat afraid of venturing into the presence of this poor heathen king." "Yes," said Brother Lacollalai, with emphasis, and in his excitement reverting to his whaleship English. "Me 'fraid. You see, I no belong to Lela. I belong to Utwe, on other side of this island. I afraid to go inside King's house here. He'd big king and break my head." A pained look came into the brethren's eyes, but the Reverend Gilead at any rate was not wanting in courage, and seizing the Reverend Purity Lacollalai by the arm, he drew him along with him. Followed by the brethren, they ascended the steps that led up to the king's house, and in another moment were inside. The room was a very large one, capable of holding half the population of the village, At the further end, seated upon mats, were the leading chiefs. Above them, lying upon a slightly raised couch, was Togusa, the sick chief. He was a man of about 30, with a thick jet-black beard and pale features, and his countenance showed traces of recent illness. The moment the missionaries entered, the natives, who were gathered outside, followed them in, the men sitting on one side of the room, the women on the other. As soon as Mr. Ball and his brethren had approached within a few feet of the king, the missionary motioned to his companions to stop and advanced alone with hand outstretched. "You are King Togusa. I am the Reverend Gilead Ball, and I bring you peace beyond price and a message from the King of Kings." The sick chief shook his head feebly in return, and failing to understand Mr. Ball's remark, inquired in broken English if he had come to buy pigs and yams. "Not pigs, my dear brother, nor yet yams, but souls." And the Reverend Gilead smiled benignantly, and then, with the rest of the brethren, sat down upon the rude stool to which the king motioned them. The Reverend Purity Lacollalai, however, sat quite apart from them on the floor, with a very uneasy expression on his face. For a moment or so, Togusa spoke in an undertone to his chiefs. He was anxious to learn the motive of the white men's visit, and felt that his limited knowledge of English was not equal to the task of carrying on a conversation with them. Presently, however, his eye lighted up when he saw, coming through the doorway, the old white man, Westall, who was attended by 4 or 5 of his half-caste sons. "Tell Charlie to come and talk to these men in their own tongue," he said to one of those of his chiefs who sat about him. Dressed in his seaman's suit of blue dungaree and holding his broad palm-leaf hat in his hand, the old seaman advanced through the crowded room, and first greeting the king and chiefs in the native language, he turned to the missionaries. "Good day, gentlemen. My name is Charlie Westall. I live here. The king wishes me to ask you what is your business, and in what way he can serve you. You see, gentlemen, he doesn't speak but little English, and so he wishes me to talk for him." Then the Reverend Gilead Ball, rising to his feet, extended his right hand, and pointing a large forefinger at the old white man, spoke. "Old man, I have heard of you. You are one of those unfortunate persons who are out of the Lord's fold, and whose dangerous and pernicious example to these poor heathens has done such harm. You may tell the king from me that I cannot talk to him through such a wicked man as you are." Old Westall laughed a soft, sarcastic laugh. "Thank ye, sir. I'll tell him that." And then, turning to the king, he said, "The white men have come here to give thee and thy people a new religion, but he will not talk of it to thee, O Togusa, by my lips." "Why is that?" said the king mildly, his dark eyes moving alternately from the face of the missionary to that of the old white man. "Because, he saith, I am a bad and wicked man, and have taught thee and thy people evil." The king's eyes flashed angrily, and he made a movement as if he would spring from his couch, but in an instant he was calm again. "That is well, Charlie. Let him then, if he mistrusts thee, find someone else to tell me of his business here in Kusai." "The king, sir," said old Westall, again addressing himself to the missionary, "says that he is willing to hear what you have to say. If not through me, then through any one of you or your ship's company who can speak his language." The calm, quiet tones of the old seaman, covering as it did the rage and contempt he felt for the person addressed, deceived not only the Reverend Mr. Ball and his colleagues, but their coloured brother, the Reverend Purity Lacollalai, as well. He now stepped forward, Bible in one hand, stovepipe hat in the other. An encouraging smile on Mr. Ball's face gave him courage to proceed. Then, in the midst of a dead and ominous silence, the native minister addressed the king. His speech was a curious one, and not at all one that even Mr. Ball, with all his ministerial pedantry and silly pomposity, would have approved of had he known its gist. First, he warned the king and his people of the wrath to come if they continued in heathenism. Secondly, that old Westall and all other white men but missionaries would be taken away by a man of war and cast into a lake of burning fire called hell. Thirdly, that the good and chosen people lived at Honolulu only, and the Reverend Gilead Ball was a very rich man and the friend of the President of the United States and God. Fourthly, that if Togusa would cast away his idols and keep but one wife, and take the missionaries to his bosom, that he would not be taken away to the lake of fire with the bad white men, but when he died, his soul would be taken in a man of war to Honolulu first, and then to Boston, to live with God and President Andrew Jackson. Fifthly, that he, Lakolalai, had been a very bad man, but now he had been washed and was filled with a powerful Ijon, witchcraft, which would make him live forever. With his chin supported on his right hand, the king of Lela listened with unmoved countenance to the native minister's speech. Then, when he had finished, he turned to Sikra, his favorite chief. "Who is this man?" he asked, and at the savage energy of his tones, the native minister quailed. "He is Lakolalai, a pig, a slave from Utwe. He went away from here 2 years ago." "Good," and a grim smile stole over the king's features. "Thou hast heard what he has said, and the lies he has told me. Does he and these foolish white men think that I, Togusa, who ever since my birth have known white men, have not heard of these wizards they call missionaries, who would steal the hearts of my people from their gods and make slaves of them to the god who rules over the lake of fire? Bah!" And he spat fiercely on the ground, and then shook his hand threateningly at the missionaries. "Away from here, I tell thee. I have heard of thee and know of thy wizardry. Shall I, Togusa, be a like fool to Kamehameha of Hawaii, the king of the Hawaiian Islands, and yield up my country and my wives and my slaves to such dogs as thee? Go, get thee away to some other land while thy lives are yet safe. But yet," and here he shot a quick glance at old Westall, "shalt thou stay here a while and see how Togusa shall do justice upon this dog of Utwe, this Lakolalai, who comes into the presence of the king of Lela and threatens him with the vengeance of the Christ God and the lake of boiling fire. Take him, men of Lela, and bind him like as a hog is bound for the slaughter." But with a wild, despairing cry, the native minister had thrown himself at the king's feet and was pleading for mercy, while from the assembled crowd of people there came a low, savage murmur, the desire for vengeance upon a slave who had insulted their king. "Gentlemen," and old Westall advanced to the now alarmed missionaries, "you had better get aboard again. I bear you no ill will for the hard words you have spoken, but you have come upon a fool's errand. The king will have no missionaries here." "Shameless and wicked old man," said one of the younger missionaries, "would you incite these raging heathens to deeds of bloodshed? Think you that we, the ministers of God, are to be lightly turned away by threats? No." And with a firm hand he grasped Gilead Ball by the arm. "I, for one, shall not desert my master, but cheerfully give up my life for the cause." With a contemptuous smile, old Westall turned away from him and walked over to and stood beside the king. Then he raised his hand. "Gentlemen, you have had your say. Now let me have mine. There is no danger to any of you, at least to any of you who are white. But listen, for 40 years I have lived here among these people, and as long as I do live here, no missionary shall ever set foot again on this island. These natives may all go to hell, as you say, but that is none of your business. They've been going there cheerful enough for the last 500 years. Now, don't be afraid, no one is going to hurt you, but the king wants to ask you a question or two before you go." With a pale face, but a certain amount of resolution in his cold grey eyes, the Reverend Gilead Ball stepped out from the others and spoke again to the king. "Beware, O Togusa, of this old man. He is a bad man." And then he suddenly ceased as the king raised himself upon his tattooed and naked arm. "Christ, man, answer me this dog here!" And he pointed scornfully at the grovelling figure of the native minister. "This dog saith that he will live forever by reason of the new faith he hath gotten from thee." "Man," said the missionary, springing forward, after old Westall had interpreted the king's words, "I implore you, nay, command you, on peril of the loss of your immortal soul, to give this unhappy heathen my true answer. Tell him that Lakolalai, God's minister, will have eternal life hereafter, even if these godless heathens now take his life." Then Westall turned to the king. "The Christ man saith, O Togusa, that this man Lakolalai will have life forever." "Ha!" said Togusa. "Now shall we see if this be true." 2 men advanced, and seizing the native minister, stood him upon his trembling feet. "Stand aside, gentlemen, if you please," said old Westall quietly to the missionaries. They moved aside, and then Togusa, calling to Sikra, the chief, pointed to the wretched Lakolalai. Take thou thy spear, Sikra, and thrust it through this man's body, and if he live, then shall I believe that he will live forever. And Sikra, with a fierce smile, seized his heavy ebony wood spear, and as he raised his right hand and poised the weapon, the men who held Lakolalai's arms suddenly stretched them widely apart. The spear sped from Sikra's hand, and spinning through the convert's body, fell near the feet of the Reverend Gilead Ball and his brethren at the other end of the room. In another hour the mission ship was under way again, and old Westall was seated at home smoking his pipe and playing with his grandchildren, and smiling inwardly as he glanced seaward and saw the white sails of the brig far away to the westward. But after all, the visit of the mission ship was long remembered by the people of Kusai, and for their wickedness were they sorely afflicted. For the garments of the late Reverend Purity Lakolalai were given by Togusa to one of his favorite slaves, who soon afterwards died of measles, and in less than a month 700 other godless heathens followed him, and old Charlie Westall, with Ted and Nia his wife, and his maidservants and manservants, and all that was his, cleared away from the disease-stricken island, and sailed in search of a new land called Ponape, which lieth far to the westward. Mrs. Mallison's rival. Jim Mallison lived on Tarawa, one of the Gilbert Islands in equatorial Polynesia. He was a tall, thin, melancholy-looking man, with pale blue eyes and a straggling sandy beard that grew upon his long chin in a half-hearted, indefinite sort of way. His trading station was situated at the most northerly point of the whole atoll, a place where the thin strip of low-lying sandy soil that belted the blue waters of Tarawa Lagoon was narrowed down to a few hundred yards in width, barely sufficient, one would imagine, to prevent the thundering breakers that flung themselves against the weather side of the island from hurtling through the thinly growing coconut and pandanus groves and pouring over into the calm waters of the inland sea, carrying everything, including Mallison's ramshackle house, before them. Dennison, the supercargo of the Indiana, had indeed mentioned the possibility of such an occurrence to Mallison one day, and offered to shift him further down the lagoon. But his offer was declined. He was quite satisfied, he said, to stay where he was and take his chance. For some unknown reason, Mallison, although on perfectly friendly terms with the 4 or 5 other white men who lived on Appiang, the nearest island in the Gilbert group to Tarawa, yet seldom associated with them. He was the only white man on Tarawa, and although the 2 islands are not a day's sail apart, he had never raised energy enough to sail his boat over to Appiang and return the many visits he had had from the traders there. But in spite of his owl-like solemnity, he was not by any means unsociable, and would occasionally unbend to a certain extent. One curious thing about him was that, although he had now been living alone on Tarawa for 2 years, he had never been married. Now, for a trader to remain single was, in native eyes, extremely undignified, and not calculated to raise him in public estimation. Any white man who could show such a disregard of the conventionalities of native life and custom necessarily became an object of suspicion to the native mind. However, as he was a quiet, non-interfering man who quarreled with no one, conducted himself with the strictest propriety, and refrained from cheating in the pursuit of his business, he gradually begat confidence and respect among the fierce, warlike Tarawans. So much so that at the end of 2 years he had become the most prosperous trader in the Gilbert group, and his huge, ill-built storehouse was generally filled to bursting with copra, dried coconut, and shark's fins whenever a trading ship entered the lagoon and dropped anchor off his station. So steadily did his business and his reputation for fair dealing increase with the natives that after a time fleets of canoes would visit Tarawa, coming some from Maracay, 50 miles to the north, and some from the great lagoon island of Apamama, 100 miles to the southeast, bringing with them their produce of dried coconut to be exchanged with the white man for colored prints, calicos, arms, tobacco, and liquor. The white men living on Appiang and the other atolls in the group could not but experience a feeling of vexation that Mallison, who, as they said, was the laziest man in the South Seas, should divert so much custom and so many dollars from their islands to his. Day after day they would see large sailing canoes filled with dried coconut and other native produce sailing past their very doors bound to Mallison's place. But being on the whole a decent lot of men, they bore their successful rival no ill will, accepted matters, after a time, philosophically, and lived in the hopes of Mallison being found cheating by the natives and either getting himself tabooed from further trading or being warned off the island by the chiefs. So one day, after business jealousies had quite subsided, they again manned their boats and visited him. And knowing that many months had passed since a ship had called at Tarawa, they bore with them the gift of friendship peculiar to the country, some half a dozen or so of Holland's gin, in order to cheer up his lonely existence by endeavouring to make him drunk. But in this they had always failed on previous occasions. For the more liquor he consumed, the more melancholy and owl-like of visage he became. They had all also, individually and severally, endeavoured to induce Mallison to give up his single life, and permit them or one of the chiefs of Tarawa to find him a suitable wife from among the many hundreds of young marriageable girls on the island. But their kindly intentions proved unavailing, for Mallison distinctly declared his intention of remaining as he was, and put some little warmth into his manner of declaring that rather than have a native wife forced upon him, he would barricade his house. "I don't want any native wife, boys," he would say solemnly. "I dessay you chaps mean well, and wouldn't see me marry a girl as wasn't no good, and means to try and make me feel more comfortable, but I ain't a-going to do it." But a plot against his further celibacy had been formed, not, it must be mentioned, without ulterior views by one of the participants therein. Mr. Andy O'Rourke, a genial, rollicking trader on the island of Appiang. He was agent for a firm trading in opposition to Mallison's employers, had a large half-caste family, and a very extensive native connection generally, both socially and in business, and for a long time past had cogitated upon the possibility of joining his fortunes with those of his successful rival to his own particular advantage financially, and that of Mallison from a domestic point of view. In short, he intended to get Mallison married, and had already made up his mind that Tara, his wife's sister, was eminently calculated to fill the position of Mrs. Jimmy Mallison. But to avoid any suspicion of underhand work, he determined to so arrange matters that no one of his fellow traders should ever suspect that he had any preconceived idea of making Mallison his brother-in-law, and set about his plans in a thoroughly open, genial Irish manner. He had therefore proposed that on the present trip to Mallison's they should, as a matter of conjugal and family duty, take their wives, children, and relatives with them. "We ought to give the women a run over to Mallison's, boys," he said when the trip was first proposed. "It's the go-go, mutton bird season over at Tarawa just now, and the women and children would enjoy themselves fine getting the eggs and birds. You'll bring your wife, Davy, won't you? Tom French's missus is coming, and a couple of his daughters, and my wife wants to bring her sister with her. What do you say, boys?" So over they came, each trader sailing his own boat, and carrying with him his native wife and half-caste family, all bent upon having a thoroughly good time at Tarawa, for the people of the two islands were now at peace. Seated aft in Andy's boat, between his wife and himself, was the pretty Tara, who had been well tutored by her sister Lebanais in the part she was to play in captivating the heart of Mallison. And although Tara had frankly admitted that she had looked to get a handsomer and younger husband than the one her brother-in-law designed for her, she was a dutiful girl and consented to sacrifice herself upon the altar of family affection with resigned and unobtrusive cheerfulness. As the boats, with their snow-white sails bellying out to the trade wind, sped along over the long ocean swell, Davy Walsh, whose boat was nearest, called out to Andy. They were all sailing close together. "I wonder how old Mallison's Piggy-Wiggy is getting on?" A general laugh followed, for Mallison's affection for his pig was a source of continual amusement to his fellow traders. About a year after he had landed on Tarawa, a passing Puget Sound lumber ship, bound to the Australian colonies, had hove to off Mallison's place for an hour or two. He had boarded her, and in exchange for some young coconuts and bananas, the American skipper had presented him with a pig of the male sex, informing him that the animal was of a high lineage in the porcine line. Malleson had been much struck with the promising proportions and haughty but reserved demeanor of the creature as it poked about the deck, and at once conceived the idea of improving the breed of pigs on the island, not of course from disinterested motives, but as a means of adding to his income. As time went on, the pig grew and throve amazingly, and the fame of the beast spread throughout the Gilbert group, and Mallison's anticipations with regard to his own profit in possessing such an animal were amply verified. Natives from outlying villages and finally from islands 100 miles distant came to look at his pig, and a deputation of leading old men, i.e. the village councillors, from Apiang visited Mallison with the object of conveying the pig as a friendly loan to their august master the king. But to this he would not consent, pointing out politely but firmly withal the risks attendant upon carrying such a valuable animal in an open canoe a distance of 40 miles. Besides that, he had become attached to the creature, he said, and would be lonely without him. The deputation thanked the trader and withdrew. As the visitors' boats sailed across the lagoon and brought to in front of Mallison's dilapidated dwelling, the trader came out of his house and walked down the beach to meet them. And Andy O'Rourke noted with envy that Mallison's storehouses, the doors of which were wide open, were full to bursting of copra. "Come up to the house," said the melancholy-looking man, shaking hands with them all in a limp sort of manner. "My boys, servants, will bring your traps up out of the boats. But," and here he glanced dejectedly at the women, "I'm afraid that my house is too small to hold you all. Perhaps the women and children wouldn't mind sleeping in my boathouse just for tonight. Tomorrow I can get a house run up for 'em." "That's all right, old chap," said Andy, slapping his solemn-visaged host on the back. "But if you don't mind, Lebanais and her sister will stay with me in your house. You see, Tara, that's her coming up now, was a bit seasick coming over, and my wife got a touch of the sun. They are both complaining a bit. However, they won't trouble you much. Just let 'em have a corner to themselves." "'Tain't much of a place for women," said Mallison disconsolately, as he looked at his dirty, untidy sitting room, with its floor covered with ragged, worn-out mats, and then at Lebanais and Tara, tall, stately, and graceful in their white muslin gowns and broad Panama hats. "You see, I does my own cooking and only straightens up once a week or so, but I'll get some of the village women to come in and clean up the place a bit." "No, you won't, old man," said Andy cheerfully. "My wife has brought plenty of sleeping mats, and she and Tara, a smart girl is Tara, will soon fix up a place." Andy now had an opening to let Mallison see what a handy girl Tara was, and what an excellent housewife she would make. So, while the wily Andy and Tom French, Dave Walsh and Pedro Callis sat outside with Mallison and smoked and drank lager beer and gin, pretty Tara, whose mind was full of the possibilities of becoming Mrs. Mallison and pleasing her sister and brother-in-law, hustled her sister about and set to work. First of all, though, she took off her starched muslin gown and hung it up carefully, revealing her shapely figure, clothed in but a short skirt of pink print, in the most innocent and natural manner possible. Then, for the next 10 minutes, she and Lebanais were busily engaged in dragging out the dirty old mats and replacing them with clean ones brought from the boats, clearing off the awful collection of empty salmon and sardine tins from the soiled table, and touching up the room here and there and everywhere. "He's very old-looking and hath weak, watery eyes," whispered Tara to her sister, who was carrying out a basket full of debris to throw away on the beach. "Speak low, thou little fool. He may hear thee. And what if he is old and watery-eyed? Is he not a white man and rich and with a good character?" Tara shrugged her smooth, rounded shoulders and went on sweeping, glancing now and then at the long, awkward figure of her prospective husband. "Well, old man," said Davy, addressing his host, "how's business and how's the pig?" "Come and see him," answered Mallison with unusual promptitude. "He's looking fine." The traders exchanged sly, amused glances, but at once rose and followed him to a little compactly built pig pen of thick coconut logs, which was sheltered from sun and rain by a wide roof of pandanus thatch. Inside, on a bed of clean grass, lay an enormous black-and-white boar pig, asleep. This was Brian. "He don't like being disturbed too soon after his breakfast," said Malison, as the four men bent over the fence and gazed at the recumbent animal. "He gets mad sometimes and don't eat." "Is that so?" said French, with an appearance of deep interest. "Yes. You see, he's got very regular habits, and don't like being worried after a meal. But anyway, as you chaps don't see him often, I'll wake him." Hoisting one of his long legs over the low coconut fence, the trader got into the pen and, slapping the huge beast gently on the rump, called, Brian, get up, old man. It's only me and Andy, and Tom French and Davy Walsh." Brian wouldn't move, but his thick, hideous lip gave a slight quiver. "He wants a lot of coaxing, don't he?" said Malison, with a faint blink of amusement, and then he began to scratch the monster's back with his forefinger. This partially roused the object of his solicitude, who gave vent to a grunt of enjoyment and, lifting one hind leg slightly, pushed it out astern. Then, with another and fainter grunt, he lay quiet again. "Won't he stand up?" queried Andy. "No, not now, but we'll come back when it gets a bit cooler. He enjoys the wind when it's a bit westerly, like it is now, and generally stands up in the corner there to get a sniff. There, do you see that little porthole I've cut? Well, he likes looking through that sometimes, watching the village pigs cruising about on the beach. I've been giving him cooked fish lately. Don't believe in raw fish for him. Heats his blood too much and gives him a kind of nightmare." "Just so," said Davy sympathetically. "Makes him cry out in his sleep, I suppose. Well, he's looking all right anyway." "Come along the beach for a bit of a stroll," said Andy O'Rourke to Malison that night. The other two men had turned in, and Andy had been waiting for a chance to have a quiet talk to his host. As they went out, Andy pointed to the recumbent figures of Mrs. Andy and her sister, who were apparently sound asleep at the end of the sitting room, and said, "They look all right and comfy, don't they?" They did look all right, and even the owl-like, watery-eyed Malison smiled approvingly. One of Tara's soft, rounded arms supported her sister's head, and her face rested against her bosom. As the men's footsteps disturbed the coral gravel that was spread over the path outside the house, the younger woman pretended to awake, rose and followed them. "Auntie," she called in the native language, "tell the white man that if he will give me a piece of soap, Lebanon and I shall wash his clothes in the morning." Result of prompting from Lebanon aforesaid during the night. Of course, Malison understood the native tongue, and as he walked away with Andy, he said that Tara was a good-hearted girl to trouble about his dirty clothes. "She is that. Look here, old man, she's a regular star of a girl. Now, I ain't going to beat about the bush. I brought her here thinking you might take a liking to her and marry her. She'll be a fine wife for you and make you comfortable. What do you say? She's willing enough, and there ain't a better-mannered girl anywhere in the Gilbert group. And what's more, there isn't any scandal about her." Malison made no reply for a minute or two. Then he began filling his pipe. After he had lighted it, he spoke. "Look here, Andy, I'll just tell you the whole thing. I'd be willing enough, but the fact is I'm a married man. My old woman is living in Auckland. She's got a rotten temper, and to make things worse, she took up with some of these here women's suffrage women and used to jaw the head off herself, telling me what a degrading beast I was to live with. Well, things went on from bad to worse, until one day I seed in the paper, as Mrs. James Malison had said, at a meeting, that she, too, had an unthinking husband as hadn't got no intelligence. That just finished me. I cleared out from her and came down here with Captain Pete to start trading. That was 2 years ago. I send her money every 6 months by the schooner, but although I won't ever go back to her again, I ain't a-going to marry no native women. It's bigamy." "No, it ain't. Not down in the islands, anyway. Why, it ain't respectable for a man to be living by himself as you are. You can marry Tara right enough. Who's a-going to know that you've a wife in New Zealand?" "I would, and Pete would. And besides that, I ain't a-going to do anything like that. My wife's a holy terror, but at the same time, I know she's an honest woman, and I won't wrong her that way." Andy gave a long whistle of astonishment. "Well, just as you like, old man, but you beat anything I ever saw as a trader. You ought to get a billet as a missionary. And do you mean to keep on living like this, all alone?" "Yes, why not? I'm all right. I'm doing pretty well, and Brian takes up a lot of my time when business is dull. How do you think he's looking?" A week later, pretty, black-browed Tara went away with her sister, still single. As the boat sailed from the white beach, Malleson stood in his doorway and waved his hand in farewell. "She's a pretty little creature," he said as he watched the boats heeling over to the breeze, "and as merry as a lark. I wonder if Brian would have took to her." Sometimes the village children would come near to Brian's sty and ask Malleson to let them give the creature a young coconut, knowing full well that the pleased trader would reward them individually by a present of a ship biscuit in return. At dusk, Malleson, carrying a huge wooden bowl full of tender coconut pulp and milk, would give the pig his last meal for the day, and then stand and lean over the fence and gaze admiringly down as Brian thrust his round pink snout into the repast. Sometimes also Malleson, although naturally a modest man, could not but feel a proud swell of bosom, when in the bright moonlight nights he would look and see perhaps 30 or 40 natives from the far end of the island, standing around the pig pen, rifles in hand, discussing the magnificent proportions and money value of its slumbering tenant. A year went by, and then one day the Indiana sailed into the lagoon. The captain and Dennison the supercargo soon came ashore and met Malleson standing on the beach. "How are you, Malleson? Got much for me this trip?" "About 90 tons of copra, Captain Pete. Did you bring me those 2 bags of maize for the pig?" "Dear, your old pig, man. But of course I've brought it. And I'm going to take you back with me this trip." "Why?" asked Malleson wonderingly. "Because I've seen Mrs. Malleson and had a long yarn with her. Here's a letter to you from her. The fact is, Malleson, she's fretting about you and wants you to come back. She told me it was all her fault, but that if you come back, she'll be a different woman and leave politics and woman suffrage alone." Malleson opened and read his wife's letter, and then looked with a troubled expression into the captain's face. "Well," he sighed, "I suppose I must go. I can't stay away from my lawful wife now she's going to turn over a new leaf and quit jawing and nagging. Can you put Brian somewhere below? I wouldn't let him make the voyage on deck. We might get bad weather on the trip. It's just coming on for the hurricane season now." The skipper gazed at Malleson in wrathful astonishment. "Curse your infernal beast of a pig! I'm not going to have the brute aboard my ship. I'll buy him from you if you like, and give him to my Kanaka crew to eat." Malleson laughed uneasily. "You're fond of your joke, Captain. However, we can arrange about him by and by after the copra is bagged and shipped." "Arrange be hanged! Do you think I'm going to carry a confounded pig as a passenger? Perhaps you'd like to bring him in the cabin. It might be arranged, though," he continued with bitter sarcasm. "Dennison and the mate and myself could sleep in the hold. That is, if the pig wouldn't find the cabin too close for him when we lose the southeast trades." Malleson turned away indignantly. He did not see anything to make fun of in his anxiety for Brian, yet he went off, feeling that Pete would relent before the day was out. But his face fell when, later on in the day, Captain Pete told him plainly that he could not possibly take the pig, not even on deck. "Sell him to the natives," suggested Dennison, who was standing near. Malleson gave an indignant reply. He never used bad language, but it was very evident that he was greatly angered at the captain's refusal to even have a deckhouse built for the pig's accommodation. However, in the course of the day, he had an interview with the local chief. Then he went back to Pete. "I've arranged with the chief about Brian. He's promised me that when I come back next trip, I'll find Brian all right and well cared for." "When you come back? What in the name of heaven are you coming back to this wretched place for? The missus won't hear of it." "She'll have to hear of it, and what's more, if she doesn't like to come back with me, she can stay behind. I mean to come back and live here. I'm doing pretty well, and don't see why I should give up my business to please her. I might have got married native fashion and been more comfortable, but wouldn't do it. It was against my conscience. At the same time, if you'll change your mind and will take the pig away with me in the Indiana, I might settle down again in New Zealand and try pig farming." "Oh, all right, please yourself," said the skipper shortly. "I'd take the pig if I could, but I can't. We've none too much room aboard now, and I can't build a deckhouse for such a hulking beast as your cursed old pig." Shortly after dawn next morning, Malleson was ready. He had spent an hour or so in meditation over the pig pen, fed Brian for the last time, and taken a tender farewell of him. And as he now stepped out of his house for the last time, he gave the chief a parting injunction, See that he eateth nothing but that which is given him by thine own hand, my friend, and that his bed be made with very little smooth pebbles, covered over with much soft, fine grass. A big stone among them doth both hurt and anger him when he lieth down to sleep. Then, as Malison and the captain walked down to the beach, the people stood around and called out in their guttural tongue, Tiak Apo, Timmy, goodbye, Jimmy. And the trader, with a last look towards the pigsty, stepped into the boat. Suddenly, a hideous sound, a combination of a snort of rage and a squeal of terror, smote upon his ear, and in an instant he had jumped out and made toward the pig pen. Just as he came in view of the lowly structure, he saw a number of native children disappearing round the back of his storehouses, and Teban, the chief, in swift pursuit, shouting out threats of vengeance. In a few minutes the chief returned and explained matters to the agitated Malison, who was now in the pen, rubbing the pig's cheeks and asking him what was the matter. It seemed that the moment Malison had got into the boat, a rude little boy had thrust a sharpened fish spear into Brian's snout to make Brian squeal. Teban swore by the shades of his father and two uncles to find the culprit and beat him. Malison didn't answer him for a while. His feelings overpowered him. Presently, he got out of the pen and walked down the beach to the boat. "Come on, man, come on," called the captain impatiently. "We'll never get away at this rate." "Look here, Captain. I've changed my mind about going. Sling my traps out again, will you? You can tell the old woman that I was glad to hear from her, and if she likes to come down here to me with you next trip, I'll try and make her comfortable and be a good husband to her. But it's no use, I can see, trusting Brian with these natives. He's trembling now like a asping leaf. Some D-boy has just been prodding the poor fellow in the nose out of pure devilment." And then, shaking hands with the disgusted skipper, the grief-stricken man hurried back to solace and soothe the angry feelings of his beloved pig. Malison is now living in a swell weatherboard house at Tarawa with his lawful wife, and Brian has took to Mrs. Malison.